Hello and welcome to the Robot Moose YouTube channel. Let's talk about LUMINSim's terrain. This is the second video in the Catching Up on LUMINSim series where we're going through the simulator's existing features together to get caught up to speed before we start developing new features. To understand LUMINSim's terrain system, we need to know how it works at a low level. Most of the current terrain logic is written in C++ via Godot's GDExtensions system and compiled into shared libraries using the software construction tool scons. The terrain system is made up of a set of static, unminable nodes and dynamic mineable nodes. Currently, the small hill and ledge in the spawn area of LUMINSim is a dynamic node, but the surrounding terrain outside of the spawn platform is static. We implemented static terrain as the terrain static 256 node. It represents a 256 by 256 square height map read from an EXR file of lunar terrain satellite data. The dynamic terrain extends the terrain static 256 node into a new node called LUMINSim. It exposes some methods for dynamic terrain operations like excavation and dirtball spawning and merging to allow for GDScript-driven terrain modifications. The LUMINSim node stores current and next height arrays to handle the terrain physics by comparing what the terrain looks like now to what it is going to look like. Each cell in the LUMINSim height map is set at 10 square centimeters for the best realism we could achieve with this system. To render the terrain, a shader lifts the height map's vertices according to a height texture, and the collisions are provided by a height map shape 3D node generated from the same data to match the rendered terrain. To make the terrain mineable, we set up the bucket attachment's leading edge to act sort of like a lightsaber. If the bucket is attached to the robot, moving into the terrain, and not being pushed back for realism, the LUMINSim excavate point method is called across the bucket's leading edge every 10 centimeters, matching the terrain cell size to simulate digging. The LUMINSim node logic then emits a signal to indicate where dirtballs should be spawned in place of the mined terrain and what each dirtball's velocity should be. That signal is then handled in GDScript by instantiating the dirtball scene with those properties. The terrain also checks its angle to match the angle of repose of lunar soil. To recap last video's explanation, a material's angle of repose is the angle at which the material begins to naturally slide down by itself. If you've ever poured sand or dirt into a pile, or looked at the sand in an hourglass, the flowing material naturally begins to landslide at a certain angle. This angle is called its angle of repose. In our terrain system, if the angle of the terrain is greater than the angle of repose of lunar regolith retrieved during the Apollo missions, the terrain breaks to be the correct angle, sometimes resulting in landslides. Dirt balls are rigid body 3D nodes with square hitboxes to better simulate how regolith tends to interlock with itself. Dirt balls try to merge back into the terrain's height map every quarter of a second. In order to attempt to merge, a dirt ball must not be in a hopper or bucket, have very small linear and angular velocities, and not have moved far from where it last checked if it could despawn. If all of those conditions are met, it waits for another quarter of a second and checks if the conditions are still met, and if so, it attempts a merge by calling LUMINSim's try-merge method. If that returns true, indicating a successful merge in a raised height map, it disables its collisions and begins to free fall through the ground, and once it's moving fast enough, it despawns. If try-merge fails 25 times, the dirtball simply despawns because it's probably stuck away from dynamic terrain and will never merge. Since dirtballs don't ever despawn in hoppers or buckets, they can be transported and dumped anywhere, including back into the LUMINSim node's height map to merge into it, or into LUMINSim's brickmaker. Dirtballs dropped into a brickmaker contribute their mass to a total, and once 10 kilograms is met, a Madsen cinder block is spawned. These are blocks modeled by Elliot Madsen, one of the members of the Aurora Robotics team, so that they are stackable by a forklift tool, and so that they interlock together nicely. One quick note about the brickmaker. The current release of the simulator on GitHub, version 1.2.1 alpha, seems to have an issue with the brickmaker. This has since been fixed, but the next release will not be out for quite a while since we're doing some major revisions of several fundamental systems. So in order to play without these bugs, you're going to have to pull the repository from our GitHub page and run it yourself. Our system has a number of issues, with the biggest being performance. We want to be able to support low-performance platforms, including web, but currently our system loses nearly half of its frame rate to the terrain system. Another fundamental drawback is the lack of support for tunnels or any sort of overhang. This comes from the terrain being a height map, which requires all points in the terrain to be the same space apart from all others, and in our case, 10 centimeters. Overlaps are just not possible with simple height maps. Our system is also limited in detail and scale. The 10 centimeter cell size makes each terrain chunk about 25 square meters, so multiple terrain chunks are needed for larger areas, which further hits performance. Bringing up the cell size would make for better performance, but also lowers terrain resolution significantly and makes it far less realistic to work with. On top of all of these issues, instantiating dirt balls when reforming terrain means that large excavations or landslides have a major performance hit. Each physics frame, the simulator has to iterate over each dirt ball to calculate its physics, and more often than not, each dirt ball is colliding with multiple other entities. Lower end platforms feel this performance hit the most, and like I said, we want good accessibility. We have a number of ideas for how to improve our terrain system. We want to move away from GDExtensions entirely if possible, as well as height maps and rigid bodies, which effectively means redoing the terrain system from the ground up. Our most promising idea so far is a voxel-based system, kind of like you can see in the game Astroneer. This would fix our lack of overhang support, performance issues, and our detail and scale issues. However, Astroneer in particular does not have dirt physics at all, so we would need to apply dirt physics to voxel terrain ourselves. Out of Ore is another game with a nice terrain system, especially for realistic excavation. It appears that they largely fake most of their physics, and by that I mean their dirt almost teleports into the buckets rather than actually falling or sliding in via rigid body physics. Their system also acts like our current one, in that the terrain is static until excavated, so there are situations where dozers are on steep cliffs or overhangs where they would realistically fall, but they don't. Along with accessibility, we're also looking for realism, so we'll likely move toward a voxel-based system like an Astroneer, but with visuals like those seen in Out of Ore, hopefully being able to utilize GPU-based dirt physics if possible. No matter how much we want accessibility, weaker systems will always struggle with processing terrain computations like this. So we are also considering putting all terrain processing onto a server-hosted terrain system where a server handles all of the voxel terrain physics, and clients simply download the updated terrain data. Such a system would solve, or at least work around, all of the issues I mentioned before. Plus, with multiplayer, downloading the terrain is already going to be necessary, so why not have a server handle all of those computations to begin with? Obviously, our terrain system is going to need a lot of work, and that work is going to take quite some time. Our goal with these videos is to find people interested in this topic and who want to be a part of LUMINSim's development process. If you want to see this system get built and be able to play with it yourself, the best way to help us do that is by supporting us on Patreon. Patreon members directly support us, so they get more insights into what goes on behind the scenes, as well as direct lines of contact with the whole Aurora Robotics team. You'll also get free access to the simulator on Steam when it's released. You'll be able to try experimental versions on private servers, and your suggestions will be our highest priority. This is just a start, and there's going to be a whole lot more for Patreon members with time, especially with your suggestions. Check out our Patreon page in the description below. That's all there is to know about LUMINSim's current terrain system. To see more, head over to LUMINSim's development wiki page, linked in the description, where I go into further detail about TerrainSim's methods and inner workings. I also put links to the games Astroneer and Out of Ore that I mentioned before, both of which I highly recommend you play yourselves. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, leave them in the comments section below, and if you liked the video, leave us a like and consider subscribing to stay in the loop on LUMINSim. Until next time.